Hello and welcome back to the Black Dad Brand Podcast. I'm your host, Jamil Pugh, and today we got a special guest. I'm super excited to interview Dr. Inniss, who is the author of this book, Being the Dad I Never Had. And so he's going to drop some absolute gems and jewels on us today. We're so happy to have him. And remember, the Black Dad Brand is about parenting style, reproductive health, career and finance, relationship, and communication. But today's episode is going to focus in on that parenting style as we go through some of the topics that Dr. Inniss discusses in his book. But as we're here with Dr. Inniss, can you just, I know you as the author, the person who wrote this book, but tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the experiences that you've had that's kind of led you to this point to write a book like this.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. First of all, I think it's important to mention that I'm from Barbados, so my experience is rooted in Caribbean culture. Growing up as a boy in the Caribbean, particularly in a lower income bracket, I found that my friends and I were all very ingenious. I think lack drives ingenuity. And so when it comes to being creative and making our own toys and making the things that we played with, I think that was one of the highlights of my youth. I see the Razor scooters today that are sold, and we made those with wood and ball bearings. We've made our own kites. We made anything that we wanted to play with, and that was fun. I think in my childhood, the only thing that I thought was a weight or anchor was the relationship that I had with my father. My father was an abusive alcoholic who really had an issue with me. I don't know if it was an issue with the firstborn, but he did not get along well with me, I should say, from a very young age, even before age 6. But that fueled a lot of energy in me. And I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot of these things later, but it fueled a lot of energy in me, which made me very committed to discipline and also very committed to achievement. So I joined what was the equivalent of ROTC in Barbados, the Barbados Cadet Corps, when I was age 11 all the way through age 18, and was able to realize my dream of being on path to be a military officer by getting a scholarship into West Point, which is the premier military institution in the world. And so that experience was ideal. It was fantastic. It was very complex, very difficult, challenging, but it also was somewhat of a utopia in that the cadet honor code led to you being in a scenario where a cadet must not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. So it was an environment where people's words mattered. And to me, that was very important and very different from what's going on in the world today. But it also was a time where I was able to nurture a negative skill that I had, which is the idea of sweeping stuff under the carpet, right? Emotionally, I had grown so accustomed to just toughing my way through things and just brushing stuff that bothered me under the carpet that by the time I left West Point, I had what you call a lumpy carpet, very hard to navigate and walk on. So by the time I turned 30, on the day of my birthday, things became different because the questions that I would typically ask had shifted. Instead of asking what was wrong with my dad, I was asking myself what was wrong with me. Instead of asking why couldn't he love, I was asking myself why couldn't he love me. And so those questions fueled a passion for understanding, which grew to a pinnacle when I had my first son and recognized that there were so many things that came to me naturally that should not, and things that did not come to me naturally that should. It is then that I recognized that I wanted to have some answers about my own existence as a man, as a father. And I set off on this journey of trying to understand it. And so made this topic my central to my doctoral dissertation. And then from that, I realized that there was a fervor and passion for understanding this dynamic for a father who had a legacy of absence and was trying to create a legacy of presence. And so that's the impetus for the book.
Wow. You said so much there. And I think it's important for folks to kind of get a sense of like all that happened in your past. And I think you do a great job of kind of explaining that in the book and kind of how you navigated, an abusive, parenting style to, end up at the premier military institution in the world. I mean, that in and itself tells a story of resilience and empowerment and just, look, I mean, it's an incredible story. But I do want, you did say something. You talked about your doctorate and you talked about your dissertation process. And so can you tell our audience just a little bit about like what exactly was your dissertation on, and maybe a little bit about the information that you gathered through a research process to learn more about other men's experience with, as you would call, an absent father. I know you have a definition for that, but so because a lot of what what you talk about in the book is not just purely your own experience, but those in which you've got through your research and talking with others. So just give us a little information in terms of like what your dissertation was on and what information you got from that.
I think that I start out with the idea that in the culture that I grew up in, education is everything. And what I recognize, and when I coach people today, I tell them that you get an undergraduate degree to get a foot in the door. You get a master's degree to get a seat at the table. You get a doctorate degree when you want to knock down the walls. And so my insight when I pursued my doctorate was that this topic I wanted to break down all the walls for. What I recognized at the time was that all the research on fatherhood or fatherlessness was quantitative in nature, where people were just relating societal ills to fatherlessness, dropout rates, fatherlessness, graduation rates, fatherlessness, spousal abuse, fatherlessness. Everything they're attributed in a causal relationship to fatherlessness, and nobody was in a numerical way, and nobody was ever really speaking about, well, what about the fatherless man? So my dissertation was called Emerging from the Daddy Issue, a phenomenological study of fatherless men and its impact on their own ability to parent boys. I left the girls scenario for someone else to follow and do, where I focus on the boys. And that was an element of selfishness. The participants in my study were ranged from university presidents all the way through to Bloods and Crips. Some of the most phenomenal experiences I've had has been talking to these people in the context of an interview. What I learned during the interview, though, is that despite our varied backgrounds, we still spoke the same language when it related to fatherlessness. And the findings from that study confirm that, because what we discovered is that we are in constant pursuit of substitutes. We turn to coaches, professors, uncles, we turn to the military, we turn to women, we turn to all kinds of things to supplement or to fill the hole that we feel that we have. We also realize that we speak the same language as it relates to what we desire from a father. A lot of people talk about men being providers and protectors, and what we as fatherless men need are teachers. They also talked about our intense desire to be different. We had a common language of the desire to be different, but we all realized that we had such a proclivity to repeat exactly what we saw. And I always tell the story of being in motorcycle school and falling amongst the cones, and the coach running out to me and asking what happened. And I said, I don't know. He said, what were you looking at? And I said, I was looking at the cones. And he took that opportunity to give me a life lesson that would go with me forever, where he said, the cones represent the obstacles. And if you're looking at the obstacles, your head, motorcycle follows your head. If you're looking at the obstacles, that's what you're going to hit. So we as men, we go, fatherless men in particular, we go through life saying, I don't want to be like him. I don't want to be like him. I don't want to be like him. And we end up being focused on the obstacle.
Well, I think that's an incredible topic. And, when you think about that, like what you're focusing on, how you tend to run into those things. And then, the opposite, you talk about the aspirational elements of like, I want to be this type of father, and searching for those different replacements and individuals who come into your lives. And for me, it was coaches, it was step parents, it was other men who chose to, invest in me as a person and to teach me different things. I mean, not having my father really opened the door for me to kind of pick and pull the best elements from the men who were in my life. And so, when my mom gave me this book, which is how I came to read your book, as my mom handed this to me. And I was at first kind of like, I don't want to read this, because it was an element in me that I needed to deal with and recognize that, you know, you didn't grow up with your father. You don't have your father. You have other men who played significant roles in your life. But some of the ways in which you discussed that in this book was really therapeutic for me. And so I appreciate you for writing this in so many ways. In a sense, I'm one of your target demographics, or folks who could benefit from a book like this. So I implore our audience to go out and to get this book. I know it's on Amazon. But I wanted to talk about another element that you mentioned in your book. And you said in your book that as you detailed your experiences with an abusive father, that you mastered self-taught skills to counteract the abuse that you were experiencing. Can you tell us what some of those self-taught skills that you mastered, and how you implemented them throughout your childhood and maybe into your adulthood?
Yeah, so there were some skills that I had to use as survival skills as a kid in that environment that I translated into my parenting. And the first one was, you know, just very practical, being able to identify when somebody had consumed too much alcohol, right? So by looking in someone's eyes and understanding their eyes, I could tell pretty much how inebriated they were, how impacted they were by alcohol. And that for me was a survival skill, because it told me where in the house I could stay. So if I realized that things were cool, I could stay in the living room. Otherwise, I needed to be in a corner in my room with the door closed, right? And so that was a skill that I developed pretty early. Um, when I think about how I translated that experience into positive skills needed for parenting, I would say that the three things that stand out to me were: one, transparency, being open with my children about my successes and my failures, being fully open to them in terms of the ability to answer questions truthfully. We as men sometimes think that we cannot be vulnerable with our sons. And I think that that's a mistake, or something that society has told us that is false.
Mm.
The second thing that I brought into my own parenting was comfort with emotionality. And that's something that I actually had to learn, because that's one of the things that didn't come to me natural that should. I had a really tough time with my sons crying in their early childhood, right? And that was because of my discomfort with emotionality as a result of the environment I was in. But I learned that that's something that I should improve upon, and I then made it very comfortable for my boys to express emotion. So there's nothing more warming in my house today than hearing one of my sons yell across the room and say, "Hey, bro, I love you, man." And that is the context within which we operate in the house. A third skill that I brought forward, or a lesson that I brought forward into my parenting, was absolutely no form of physical discipline.
Wow.
And I made that decision from even before my sons were born, because I knew that the use of physical discipline, or beating or hitting, is not a result of the child's action. It's a result of the parent running out of options, and being at their own wits' end as to what is needed to correct the behavior. And I can tell you from my sons now, my sons are 16 and about to be 15 respectively, and I am thoroughly impressed with their discipline, and how they approach to life. I mean, the thing that would get my boys right now, you could you could probably hit them, but the thing that would get to them is if you said to them, um, "I expect better from you," right?
Mm.
And so they're self-driven around expectations and behaviors that are aligned with those expectations.
I think that is very powerful. I think about, you know, when you think about coaches, or, you know, other individuals who essentially play the role of a father and have the ability to interact with someone and get them to do better or to perform better. It's that innate feeling in the individual to not want to disappoint the person who believes in them the most, the person who invests in them the most, the person that cares about that relationship that they've developed to say, I'm gonna do this because I don't want them to be disappointed. You know what I mean? And so I know that was the case for me in a lot of ways, and I was fortunate to have folks who I just didn't want to disappoint, or that I wanted to show better. And when I did do, wrong, they didn't have to hit me, even though I was whooped as a child, but it didn't impact me in a negative way. I actually kind of deserved that. I was a pretty off the rails kid. But you have two boys, right? And you talk about fathering these two young men in your book, and you talk about being a better father to them than what you receive. But in what other ways were you intentional about parenting these men differently than your experience?
Yeah, I think in what ways was I more intentional? I think that the things I just mentioned around transparency, acceptance of emotionality, no physical discipline, but I was also very intentional about showing them my achievements and success.
Yeah.
Making sure that my sons have been with me on speaking gigs. They've seen an audience that is wants to get to talk to dad, and that dad has something to say. Um, I've also been intentional about when stuff is going wrong. When I've lost jobs, when I have lost contracts, and talking to them about the importance of that, and coming back from those things. Um, I've been very intentional about teaching my boys about you can be knocked down 99 times, but if you get up 100 times, you're fine. You can keep pressing, and I see that in them. I see that in their sports. I see that in their academics. I see that desire to take the hits and move forward with that. So there's intentionality there. I think that also a reflection of that intentionality was now my boys are old enough where they check on me. Like, Daddy, you okay? And so a couple of weeks ago, my oldest son was checking on me, and he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." He said, "But are you happy?" I said, "Well, I'm struggling with a couple things." And he said, "Well, I'm gonna need to talk to you about that after school."
I'm gonna need to talk to you after I get out of school.
I'm gonna need to talk to you about that after school. So we came home from work and we went to the movies. I dropped them off at the movies, and when I picked them up, I was driving in the car and I sighed. And he said, "Dad, what's wrong? We have to continue that conversation we were having, right?" And he said, I said, "Well, it's just there's some things in life that are not realized for me, and sometimes I struggle with that." And he said, "Dad, you're an immigrant. You're an immigrant with a PhD.
Yeah.
Like, how many PhDs you know that are immigrants? You're a walking miracle. And when I think about the cards that you were dealt, it is very hard for me to understand how I am going to realize all the expectations that I have of myself." Right? So some really powerful things where he says I'm dope, right?
Yeah.
That where that intentionality about showing him my flaws and showing him my successes have created internal expectations for him that drives him. And that's all I need. Nothing else. Nothing else.
Wow, I mean that's incredible to kind of see the type of parenting and intellect and wisdom that you've instilled in your kids be reflected back into you in a situation where they feel empowered enough to one, check on you, have a conversation like that, but also feel like the relationship is there where that's kind of expected. So I mean that's an incredible story to share with us. But I'm kind of curious, as you're kind of 15, 16 years into your parenting, has that shed any light or given you any additional clarity as to some of the challenges that your father may have been going through, which may have led to, his substance abuse, or maybe, the struggles and ways he kind of, interacted with you, and how is that relationship today?
Yeah, it's very interesting because in my research work, I came up with this concept of an environment of desensitization. And it's an environment very much like the culture we grew up in that embraced the consumption of alcohol, but also embraced that's what moms and grandmas do. They raise kids, right? That's not what we do, right? So that embracing, that's the environment that he was in, and that's unfortunate. For years I went back home to Barbados with the intent of telling my father that I forgive him. And what I recognize is that every year that I got there, something would happen within the first 3 minutes, and I'd be like, okay, I'll hit him up next year.
Yeah.
So, on the last time that I tried, he was actually in the psychiatric hospital because he had relapsed with alcohol.
Wow.
And as I spoke to him, I recognized that, when I asked him about how he was going to live, he started to tell me about how he wanted to die. He actually said to me, hey, David, don't bury me in the fancy cemetery. You can just bury me in the churchyard. Don't bury me in a fancy box. You can just put me in a simple box. And for me, I realized that when I was asking him how to live, he was telling me about how he was going to die. And I started to think about my perceptions of alcoholism and how alcoholism was a choice and not a disease. So I thought he chose alcohol over us. And what occurred to me is that he had given up the potential of two amazing sons, the amazing marriage to a woman and my mother, and therefore nobody would do that intentionally. And I recognized at that point that um, he had an involuntary set of consequences that he lived for the rest of his life. His lifestyle never recovered. And I thought the empathy in me suggested that, that is unfortunate that the world is so unforgiving in that light because he gave up a lot with just a core set of mistakes that he made.
Wow. I want to kind of pivot to more from this book, which, as we talked about, has some practical elements that people can really pull from. And you talk about the trial and error fathering that, in many ways could look like. For example, you talked about not having a reference point to handle a certain situation. You talked about going with your intuition. And if that doesn't work, trying something else. Or just being confronted with a situation that you've never seen before. Can you talk about like what you have learned from that process of a trial and error fatherhood style, and if there's any advice for fathers searching for answers to be more prepared for how they go about their parenting?
Right. So that trial and error fatherhood is what we start with.
Yeah.
And it was what I started with prior to consuming all this information and crystallizing it into the 7 recommendations that came out of the book, right? So the trial and error fatherhood suggests I don't have a model, but I'm not going to quit. So I'm just going to try this. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to ask somebody else and I'm going to try this. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to keep going. In the meantime, the very thing that we're trying to avoid, which is creating lifelong wounds in our children, sons or daughters, trial and error parenting, the error part can ultimately create lifelong wounds, which is something that we're trying to avoid. So if my thought process was that if I can provide fathers a leg up in 7 tips that they can use, then they may avoid some of the trial and error, avoid some of the error that would cause lifelong wounds in their children. So the first piece of advice that I would have would be, establishing a contract. What we put in writing is stuff that we take seriously. And it was interesting to me that every single relationship of worth, leases, mortgages, car purchases, jobs, all those are things that we put in writing and write a contract to. But yet the most important role that we can play on this earth, we don't have a contract for. So I wrote a contract to my sons when they were in the NICU explaining the type of father I was going to be. And I think the first tenet was, I will always love and respect your mother. And that went all the way through to simple things like, I will teach you how to fly a kite and how to throw a ball. I will show you my flaws, be transparent with you, all the way through to giving them a spiritual grounding, right?
Wow.
And that contract, I think, is important. The second one is build resilient qualities, right? So when adversity happens, resilience is when we respond to adversity. Build resilient qualities by nurturing your decision making in the face of adversity. Naturally, as humans, we try to go back to the status quo. The status quo is not always the best. Look to see how you can grow through adversity. The next one was this idea of being the best you and not a better him. And I touched before on this idea of obstacles and focusing on obstacles, and the idea that we can't focus all the time on being better than the father that failed us. What we can do is focus on being the best us. And so that's important as well. The fourth tenet here is about embracing the fact that fathers and masculinity as a whole is viewed as through the lens of being a protector, being a provider. And society says that that's what we do. When I interviewed fatherless men, what they said they wanted most from their father was a teacher. Teach me how to do this. Teach me how to do that. So as fathers, I would think that you would spend the time to teach your son how to throw a ball. Teach your son how to fly a kite. Teach your son how to ride a bike. Those things are memories that will go with you forever. But also teach your son how to tie a tie. Teach your son how to shave, right? Those are things that, as you become a teacher, you will notice the imitation, right? You will notice, and the best compliment is imitation. You'll notice them trying to model themselves after you. Another thing is this idea of presence over perfection. We tend to only want to show up when we got it all together, right? When it's perfect, it looks right, the situation is perfect, and we have learned enough that we can do it. And that's not necessarily what our children need. They didn't ask to be here, and they don't ask for your perfection. They simply ask for your presence. Just be there in a format that is viable for their own growth. The second to last tip is embrace the emotional man, right? So as you raise your son, embrace emotionality. Allow them to know that their feelings matter. And I'm not saying that, there's a conflict between being soft and accepting emotionality. I'm by no way encouraging anyone to be soft, but there's a line to walk where someone develops the skills to be able to cope with life's challenges, right? And to know how to seek help and so on. That's what I'm recommending. And the last tip is one that kind of covers them all, which says, fill your fatherhood bag. One of the things I learned at West Point, which is a leadership-driven school, is that you go through life and you'll encounter lots of leaders. And every leader is going to have an aspect of them that you like, and they're going to have some aspects of them that you don't like. You can be a parasite, and you just throw stuff that you like in your bag, and you go back and you use it later. Do the same thing for fatherhood. There are fathers that I've stolen so many ideas from because they're really good at certain things. And I just threw it in my fatherhood bag and used it later. So those are the steps I would recommend for coping with this whole trial of fathering.
I think that's so great. And as I was looking and reading through your book and you went through those 7 elements, the one that really stood out to me was teach, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what I'm realizing with my own children, 4 and 9 months old, is that you have to teach them everything. They are a blank slate completely. And there's so many elements that I want to tell my daughter and explain to her, but I have to first give her the principle of what it is, what it does, then how does it work. And so for me, it's kind of like, you're not talking to a person who's been there before. And I think as parents, if you're not there, and you talk about an absent parent, if you're not teaching your child something, you're not parenting. Like
Right.
and you're missing out on, such an important element of raising your child, knowing you had impact on how they make decisions and how they approach life. And you talked about building these resilient qualities and so much of that. So when people talk about, oh, I pay child support or I'm a provider, you're doing a fraction of what parenting is, in my opinion. And so
Of course.
that's always something that stood out to me as like, no, you need to be there. And I know everybody's situation is different, and there's some ways in which people can't be there for their kids in those ways. I think about the military parents who have to serve and protect this country and may not be able to do some of these different elements. But it is so important, and it's a great process to teach your children. And as a college and career counselor who's done this work for quite some time, I often come across students whose parents hadn't taught them certain concepts or certain thoughts, and I just think, wow, here's an opportunity for me to feed into that kid. But you often wish that parents had either the time or the wherewithal or the, like you said, fill your parenting bag, so that they can work with their children. Now, with that being said, you mentioned the personal impact and consequences of a fatherless child and how that sometimes get lost in the shadows. And I thought about, and we talked about this before, you mentioned graduation rates, dropout rates, propensity towards substance abuse, and incarceration, right? By you not being there as a father, these things tend to be a consequence. Can you discuss those impacts and consequences of absent father and what you've learned through your studies or research?
When I first approached this topic, I noticed that there were a lot of authors in the space that sought causal relationships between societal ills and the issue of fatherhood. So, there were stats around incarceration rates, that a significant percentage of men in prison were without a father. They talked about comparing to children in two-parent homes and children in single-parent homes. The experience of poverty before age 11 is, 75% in a single-parent home versus 25% in a dual-parent home. They talked about the propensity to smoke cigarettes. Um, they talked about spousal abuse, and those who have participated in spousal abuse typically had experiences um, without a father in their lives. Um, Graduation rates, or dropout rates, I should say. Those who drop out tend to be those missing a father. Mm. But what they did not talk about was, what is the solution? And I thought the solution was rooted in the fatherless man, the one that was sitting in the gap between a legacy of absence and looking to make a legacy of presence, right? One that was more interested in kind of principles more than property, right?
Right.
And values more than valuables, right? That's to me what the definition of legacy is. And so there was this person that's sitting in the gap trying to do those things, and they were not getting any attention from the research world in terms of understanding what they felt, what were their own fears, what were some of the concerns that they had. And so I that's the reason why I pursued a more qualitative approach to the research and understanding that fatherless man. So those impacts, while great in showing some correlation between these negative skills, negative things, and fatherlessness, I don't think that they captured holistically the notion that there are people behind the numbers, and the people behind the numbers matter, and they are important in drafting the solution to these challenges.
All right. Yeah, so thank you for spending so much time sharing so much valuable information. We truly appreciate your commitment to impacting the lives of fathers. And so please tell us where we can find your book, so that more people can follow you. So do you have social media accounts or anything like that?
So Innocence, INNISSENSE. That's my handle on all social media accounts. Um, and my book is available on Amazon. And I'm working on a second edition of this that talks about fathering through the breakup, uh, which is something really, it's just something that we face as fathers. As committed as you are to fathering, there's sometimes the adult relationships don't work out. And that does not mean that our roles stop. So, yeah. Yeah.
Wow. So thank you again for that. We appreciate it. And so we hope to have you on again in the future. I think you have so much more to share. We'll go through more of what's in your book. But folks, go out there, purchase this book, look it up on Amazon. I think it's an incredible read. And so we'll have more from Dr. David Inniss in the future. Thank you.